p.m. Let's call the meeting to order. Mr. Clerk,
Mayor Joseph,
here.
Councilman Galvin.
Here.
Vice Mayor Keys.
Here.
Councilman Bieneme. Councilman Desime.
Here.
Mayor, we have a quorum.
Okay, Pledge of Allegiance with Officer William Raines. If not, we'll get somebody else.
Everyone, please place your hands on your heart. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And Mr. Joe, can you please lead us in invocation before we proceed?
Let us bow our heads for prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to meet here tonight to discuss the affairs of the city. We pray for your direction. We pray for your guidance. We pray for civility as our leaders officiate over this event, and we ask that you take those that are on their way safely. We pray in your name. Amen.
Amen. Okay. Mr. Manager, do we have any additions, deletions, or amendments to the agenda?
Actually, not at this time. The only thing that might be on the for discussion is the discussion of or replacement of the city manager.
Okay, the no special presentation, city events, none? No one here to go over the city events?
Actually, we try to keep
City
it at
projects updates, none. Hurricane preparedness, no?
no.
Okay, need a motion to approve consent?
Second.
Motion was made by Councilman Desime to approve the consent agenda. It was seconded by Councilman Galvin. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Item passes 5-0. Tab N as in Nancy. Proposed ordinance of the mayor and city council, proposed ordinance first reading of the mayor and city council of the city of North Miami, Florida, adopting the evaluation and appraisal-based amendments to the city of North Miami Comprehensive Plan in accordance with the requirements of Rule 43C-49 Florida Administrative Code in Section 163.3191 Florida Statute 2014, amending the future land use, transportation, housing, infrastructure, coastal management, conservation, parks and recreation, intergovernmental coordination, economic public school facilities, and capital improvements elements of the North Miami Comprehensive Plan, adding a climate change element to the North Miami Comprehensive Plan, providing for annual update to the capital improvement element specific to capital improvements schedule, providing for data and analysis, supporting adoption of goals, objectives, and policies of the elements, providing for transmittal and subsequent adoption of amendments, additions, and deletions to the goals, objectives, and policies of the elements, providing for transmittal of such proposed amendments to the State Land Planning Agency for review in accordance with Section 163.31843, Florida Statute 2014, providing for repeal, conflicts, severability, codification, and an effective date. That is tab N as in Nancy.
There's nothing from staff?
Yes, Mayor, there's a presentation from staff through the consultants.
For the record, Tanya Wilson Sejour, Community Planning and Development Manager. I'll read the staff recommendation into the record before a consultant comes forward. Staff is recommending that the Mayor and Council adopt the proposed ordinance to update the city's comprehensive plan and to transmit the 2015 evaluation and appraisal review-based amendments to the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity and all applicable agencies as required by state law. Just to quickly recap, the Mayor and Council recalled back on August 25th, this item was heard. At the time, 11 of the 12 chapters of the comprehensive plan were unanimously agreed to and approved by the council. However, the 12th chapter, the future land use element, did not receive a supermajority vote. At the time, the votes were 3-2, and as such, the item failed for lack of a supermajority. Along with the discussion, the Mayor and Council had directed our consultant to undergo feasibility studies based on the major corridors outlined in the plan. Feasibility studies were to be done based on the proposed heights and densities that were suggested at that time. Our consultant has prepared feasibility studies. Those are included as a part of your packet. I'm going to introduce our consultant that's here tonight to go over the presentation. We have Jeff Cadens, that's with the Melgen Planning Group, and he's a senior project manager with the Melgen Planning Group, and I'm going to invite Jeff to come forward at this time to go through the presentation, and then the council can entertain questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Mayor and Council, my name is Jeff Cadams. I'm a planner with the Melgen Planning Group. I have a CNUA accreditation, which is Congress of New Urbanism, and I had been in the inaugural class of the Form-Based Codes Institute. So I focus what my practice is on land development codes and placemaking through the principles of urbanism. We undertook the study to examine some of the issues that the council has been grappling with. Two of the basic variables that have been part of the dialogue are density and height. And mind you, I have not been firsthand involved in the comprehensive plan update. I have Eric Swanson here from my office if we get deep into goals, objectives, and policies and whatnot. But based on the characterizations of the discussions thus far, I wanted to introduce two additional variables, which are massing and community character. For this study, what we did is we created three-dimensional graphic models of proposed height standards for corridors where the council desired additional height. These were the corridors where 300 feet in height were proposed. This was Dixie Highway north of the central business area, northwest 119th Street west of I-95, northwest 7th Avenue on the east side of the corridor, and the west side of Biscayne Boulevard at 123rd Street. An additional site was added to that, and that's a parcel on North Bayshore Drive. Why are we doing this study? No, it's all right. We're doing this study to illustrate the standards that the council approved at its August 25th meeting in order to give meaning to the numbers. Design is obviously a very graphic-intensive visual exercise. And seeing what the numbers, how they play out in physical form is very important. So hopefully the results of this study will assist the council in directing the character of redevelopment within the city. Specifically, what we did is we evaluated the suitability of a Biscayne Boulevard site for a 150-foot building, which is including 40 feet from incentives. So it was 110 by right with 40 feet of incentives. Secondly, we selected a sample block from one of the other corridors where a 300-foot height was proposed on the 25th, and that's Dixie Highway. We rendered 300-foot buildings on the sample block that met minimum code requirements for compatibility. And then we looked at alternatives to the extent that we found impacts on the neighborhood, such as shadows or scale issues. We then also specifically modeled the North Bayshore Drive site for a 250-foot building. When determining what we felt was suitable, a suitable height for a corridor or a site, we looked at several things, chiefly the desired character of the adjacent land pursuant to the future land use element, given the scale and type of buildings that exist or are called for, the role that each corridor fills in the community, such as pedestrian community scale versus high-speed pass-through, for example, corridor right-of-way width, and the configuration and dimensions of blocks and parcels, which are sometimes irregular and sometimes very uniform in some of these corridors. And we also looked at the shadows that are created by the various buildings. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, the way we approach this study, even though we evaluated maximum intensities on a given parcel that we were looking at, we're really more concerned with the overall effect of this type of development of any level on the city's urban fabric. So we're looking at the city and at neighborhoods as a whole component, not just at one site in isolation. First, a couple of concepts. One is density, which has been discussed a lot. Density is a growth management tool. It's a very clinical term, and it does a good job of measuring impacts. Density does not, however, correlate well with appearance and urban form. If you look at the two buildings pictured in the slide, obviously the building on the left has much higher density than the building on the right, except that it doesn't. They're actually the same. That's a pretty extreme example of two very different scale buildings that have the same density. But you really can't design by density, and you can't see it directly. You can see the impacts of density in terms of traffic, but it's not something we use when looking at compatibility from a design standpoint, so I'm not going to really discuss it much. Towards the end, I will give you density ranges for various heights of buildings, however. The next concept is massing. If you look at this diagram, you'll see that all the buildings relate to each other fairly well. You have some taller buildings in the center, you have lower buildings on the outside. The lower buildings are connected, and there is a relationship between all of these buildings. If you just looked at them as nothing more than building blocks, they coexist well with each other. There's nothing abrupt or incompatible about any of the buildings that are situated in that slide. On the next slide, it's the same thing. This is looking at it from a street view, and you can see that these are buildings of various height. Some of them might have commercial on a ground floor, or possibly upper floors. Some of them might be all residential, but they all coexist fairly seamlessly with each other, and there's no incompatibility created. The next concept is using the transect to get a handle on community character. The transect is a tool that planners use in some cases that is used to characterize the urban context and actually apply measurements to it. So as you go from rural, which is called Transect Zone 1, all the way to T6, which is an urban core, akin to downtown Miami, various things change. Things such as the relationship of buildings to land, buildings to each other, and buildings to the street are all things that change. In a T3, which is what most of North Miami would fall into, you can characterize this as detached buildings with generous yards. That describes most of the single-family nature of the city. T4 would be more attached buildings, whether they're townhomes or row houses, with shared yards. A T5 has an increased level of verticality, more mixed use, and virtually no yards, and a reliance on on-street parking and structured parking versus surface parking. And T6 is very intense. It's a place. It's a T-zone that most places don't have. A lot of places don't want to have because it's very, very urban. Next slide. This just shows where the city is on the transect scale. This is an oblique shot of a random shot of North Miami, and you can see that it's vastly single-family detached residential. And you can see on this diagram where some of the heights that are being proposed would fall. They'd fall into the most urban category. So we have a T3 suburban type situation for a lot of the city, and the proposal has been to take parcels fronting certain corridors and essentially create a T6 type environment along those corridors without really exploring the T4 and the T5 that lie in between. So here's a 3D illustrative model, and you can see the graduation of building types, building placement, and densities and intensities from suburb all the way on the left to city core all the way on the right. One of the variables that changes throughout the transect is street enclosure. And street enclosure is the degree to which a pedestrian or someone driving through a street feels that there is a sense of intimacy, a sense of enclosure. So in this example, this is building height to street width. You have a 1-to-4 ratio, and it's typically suburban. And the reason it is because the buildings are pushed back behind parking lots. The next one is almost exactly 1-to-4, not greater than 1-to-4. And you can see that in this case, the parking lots have been put behind the buildings, and you get a very basic sense of enclosure, similar to what you'd find on a main street. At a 1-to-2 ratio, it's the same street width, parking still in the rear, but now we have taller buildings that are half the width of in height that the right-of-way is in width. And this would be similar to a T4 or T5 type situation. At a 1-to-1, you have a very intimate sense of enclosure. The street feels more comfortable to pedestrians. And it's very urban, but it's not overtly vertical in nature. And this is a typical T5 type situation. And this is a situation with 8-story buildings in this particular case. When you go to 2-to-1, you now have buildings that are twice the height that the street is wide. And now the environment takes on a very vertical aspect. And pedestrians start to become uncomfortable because of that verticality. Now, in this case, for the Dixie Highway corridor, for example, if we had these 16-story buildings on Dixie, you would have a 2-to-1 ratio. So that's a 16-story building. A 300-foot building would be between 3 and 4-to-1. And here you can see a 3-to-1, which would be equivalent to a 240-foot building on Dixie or a 315-foot building on 119th. And a 4-to-1, which would be a 320-foot building on Dixie or a 420-foot building on 119th or Northwest 7th. There's a technique that's used, stepping back the buildings from the street above a certain level of height, and it lets more light into the street, creates a little bit of a greater sense of openness. But this is a very difficult technique to use in North Miami because the parcels are squeezed from the front and the rear. You'd be setting back the building tower from the front and doing the same thing even more so from the rear because there's typically a single-family neighborhood right behind it. And so you need very deep parcels in order to accomplish that. This is an aerial photo of 3 towers, probably Surfside. Towers of this type, and these are approximately 300-foot towers. They're generally limited to metropolitan downtowns like Miami. In some cases, we have some buildings like that in Fort Lauderdale, and along the beach in the bay. They concentrate a lot of dwelling units in a very small area, and so they tend to concentrate their traffic impacts. Other characteristics of towers like these are that they don't really play with the other buildings on the street or the street itself. They're essentially vertical gated communities, if you will, and they don't tend to have a lot of interaction with the street. They tend to be relatively isolated. Now in these 3, they all have big amenities decks, and typically The developer is going to maximize the building footprint. You're generally not going to see open space because they went up, but you will see private open space in the form of amenity decks. So the public is not necessarily going to get anything from it, but the residents will get their amenities above the parking garage usually. And this just shows you the shadows that are cast by these buildings. Mass is a very important concept as well. A tall, skinny tower has a different effect than a slab-like tower. In this case, this is a 25-story tower that would probably fit within the 300-foot height limit proposed for some of the corridors. And if you were living 3 or 4 houses down from it, you could see the effect that this would have on air circulation as well as a shadow. Here's a building, little taller. This is a 30-story building. It's not quite as massive, but again, it's out of scale with a single-family neighborhood. The next building is 12 stories. It would be considered possibly a mid-rise building, and it's better, but still very tall when you're juxtaposing it on a single-family neighborhood. The next slide shows you how tall even a 15-story building is relative to a single-family neighborhood. Now, this one was not very well planned. It was plopped on a very shallow lot, and it doesn't transition very well from the single family. But it is literally the buildings like these that resulted in the Miami 21 form-based zoning code. They don't allow these anymore. This is a view of the same building from the back where it abuts a single-family residence. And the lower part of the building, which we call the podium, is parking. So that's 4 stories of parking, and the tower is above the podium. Even a 10-story building must step down to the scale of a single-family neighborhood. And this one shows you how the building does a very good job of stepping down in height and mass to a residential street. This technique requires deeper lots to do this well. A building that is approximately 8 to 10 stories can do that. The taller you get, the deeper the lot that is required. This is another technique for blunted step downs, where you're not stepping down directly to the level of the neighborhood, but you employ intermediate building types, which you can see better on the next page. These are apartments, 3-story apartments, and when put next to this larger structure, they do a good job of transitioning to a single-family neighborhood. This building here is 15 stories on a 120-foot right-of-way with a very wide landscape median. If we put the same building on the other side of the right-of-way, now you have 2 opposing 15-story buildings. It's clearly urban, but very comfortable. You have approximately a 1-to-1 ratio between building height and street width. If we were to put these same 2 buildings on Dixie Highway, for example, which is a 70-foot corridor, this is what it would look like. These are 15-story buildings. You'd have to double these to get the 300-foot height limit, and you could see how fairly claustrophobic that would make the Dixie Highway corridor. Furthermore, if you have more of these buildings lining the street, you tend to get a prolonged street wall effect, and you get a sense of enclosure that borders on a canyon effect. That brings us to the mid-rise building type. This is a building type that is 4 to 8+ stories. The one you see here, you see 2 of them lining this particular street. This is a street approximately the width of Dixie Highway. These are 6 to 7-story buildings on an approximately 70-foot right-of-way. You can see that it's very urban, but it's not overpowering. It's appropriately scaled, and you still see a lot of sky, not a lot of shadow here. 5 to 8 stories is the sweet spot in terms of creating urban street enclosure and bringing apartments to corridors of densities that support transit. With 5 to 8 stories, you can easily get 40 to 50 units to the acre without encroaching too far into the single-family neighborhoods, because there's not a lot of step-down that has to occur. And using this building type or favoring this building type tends to spread the density throughout the city and enable a larger area of the city to redevelop with the 5,000 units and the pool of commercial square footage that you have to use right now. One tower at 300 feet is equivalent to about 4 mid-rise parcels of the same size. These types of mid-rise buildings offer a more intimate scale, and there's a science to this where with buildings that are considered lower mid-rise, the people even on the upper floors are engaged with what's happening on the street. They don't feel so far removed as compared to being on the top of a 20-story building where they feel that disconnect from the street. And that also ties back to CPTED principles, crime prevention through environmental design, where there's eyes on the street and the feeling of those people on the street that there are people looking out and paying attention to what's happening. Now, this is Fifth Avenue in Naples. This is only 2 stories to 3 stories, but it's still a very nice corridor. People like to go and walk it, and it still has somewhat of an urban effect while being very compatible with the single-family neighborhoods. So the point of talking about these mid-rise buildings is that you don't need very tall buildings for high densities and an urban environment, and that the mid-rise buildings tend to relate, in our opinion, better to the neighborhoods that you already have and the parcel configurations that you have along the corridors we looked at than do buildings that are very tall, which would be a 300-foot building. These buildings, as I said, they play well with each other. They go one next to the other. They don't need any spacing between them. And no measures have to be taken to address compatibility. Now let's get to the specific recommendations. There you go. This is the Dixie Highway study site. This is actually within the NRO. And we looked at some parcels around the actual subject parcel, which is delineated by the arrow. And as you go north, you get out of the NRO. So this is the context of West Dixie Highway. You can see that obviously it's a predominantly single-family neighborhood. There are some multifamily buildings sprinkled in. You've got some schools as well, but it's mostly single-family. Because Dixie Highway cuts at a 45-degree angle through the neighborhood, you've got irregular blocks and irregular parcels. Now, this is what a 300-foot tower looks like just from a scaling perspective. This is a very massive tower. It's probably well over 200 feet wide, so it's a little bit bulky looking. A tower like this really doesn't fit into anything that surrounds it. If the city wants to go this route, then the city should also be looking to change the form of the neighborhoods around it. It's really not compatible with single-family neighborhoods. This slide here shows you from the street behind this building, and there's a single family on the right. It's hard to gauge the scale of it. But here's a cross-section. Literally, if you just cut the Dixie Highway section looking north in half, that's what you'd see. And so, where are we? If you can see the cursor, these are single-family homes here. And these would be towers up to 300 feet in height. As you can see, there's a tremendous difference in the scale of the neighborhood and these types of buildings. And the nature of Dixie Highway and cutting diagonally through the neighborhood kind of exacerbates that effect. This is a street view. This was all modeled. And actually, it's a very attractive street view here. We've got a plaza on the corner. And we're kind of looking at the study area from the outside. So here you have a wide intersection. It's a 5-way intersection, so it sort of opens up here as you get into the study area where we would have the taller buildings. Now we're looking at it from inside the study area, and the effect changes. Now you see that it's a very vertical environment. and it's rather confining. And again, that's because it's a 70-foot corridor. It's a very narrow corridor. If the corridor were to actually be built out at substantially 300 feet, just the adjacent parcels were modeled here, and you can see the shadows that are cast. You get somewhat of a canyon effect. It goes back to the height to width ratio that we talked about earlier. It's a little much for a street like Dixie Highway. I talked earlier about if you do want buildings of this height along the corridors, then a natural next step would also be to start encouraging redevelopment of the neighborhoods behind it. So you'd see transition building types like the one I've got the cursor on here and here, where you have 2 or 3 story apartments, perhaps townhomes and whatnot. This demonstrates the afternoon shadow in the winter, which would be the greatest shadow, from a 300-foot building. So you can see it extends to the block to the northeast of it. And actually, can you go to the next one? And this is a 10 a.m. winter shadow from a 300-foot tower in the winter. So there's a significant shadow. If you go back one. Now, these are, again, are mid-rise building types, and just get a flavor for what this type of environment gives you versus the types that we just modeled. Okay, so for West Dixie Highway, we considered in making our recommendation that this corridor traverses predominantly single-family neighborhood, that it's a 70-foot, 4-lane corridor. It's got irregular blocks, irregular parcel and block depth, and that mid-rise and high-rise construction will, in a lot of cases, require assemblage of parcels and encroachment into some of the single-family blocks. So we're recommending in this case that you stick with the 110 feet where it's warranted, where it can meet compatibility requirements in your code, which would be massing standards and transitionary standards. But that 110 feet should be inclusive of parking, because we're not looking at floor area ratios here where the parking area doesn't really count as floor area. We're looking at height, we're looking at scale, we're looking at design. And it doesn't matter whether it's a parking level or it's an inhabited level, it still adds to the mass of the building. The purpose of this, and this was actually modeled from the study area, is simply to show you that this is human scale development. People like to be in areas where they feel comfortable. And the way you get that is with mid-rise type buildings, but not large towers. You can see just looking around that you get a feeling that these buildings sort of are part of the streetscape. When you're looking up 20 stories at a tower at an apartment, you just don't get that. It's really not the same scale. Okay, this is a shadow for a 110-foot building, and it's highlighted here in the dotted line, and you can see that it basically retains its shadow. It really doesn't make it more than across the street and minimally impacts other parcels. Okay, after modeling this, we then took the same principles and looked at 119th and Northwest 7th. This is 119th west of 95. This is a 100-foot wide corridor. It's a 6-lane major arterial road. The entire block depth of about 250 feet is planned for commercial and office. And it's the same 250-foot block depth all the way down the corridor, so it's very consistent. Again, behind it is a large single-family neighborhood. Here again, we're recommending 110 feet with appropriate transitions. And the reason is that, as illustrated on the next slide, you have to address the conditions that exist in the front of the building and in the back of the building. In the front of the building, you have the arterial frontage, where the higher building is appropriate. Here, in this case, approximately 10 or 11 stories. But then when you get to the back, you have a residential street. And these aren't multifamily residential streets. These are single family. And as long as you want it to stay that way, you need to transition the buildings appropriately. So in this case, this is roughly a 250-foot deep lot, and you can see how this is a 10 or 11-story building, how it transitions fairly well to the neighborhood behind it. Noting that those the dwelling units on that street are actually multifamily in this picture, not single family. On Northwest 7th Avenue, this is also a 100-foot corridor. It's planned and developed for commercial use. The west side block depth is typically 150 feet. It's quite consistent, but not 100%. And the west side abuts single-family residences. There tends to be an alley in between the single-family and the commercial area, the frontages, parcels. The east side is much deeper. It's in excess of 300 feet and abuts the interstate. Clearly, taller buildings are appropriate on the west side, the east side as compared to the west side. The council proposed to retain the 55 feet on the west side, and we don't disagree with that at all. And on the east side, you can go pretty high. We think 200 feet is very appropriate. We're not certain that going higher than 200 feet would be a good result. But even with the 200 feet, we would recommend that buildings not be able to achieve that height fronting directly on the corridor. They should be pushed mid-block or closer to 95. We feel that would be quite appropriate. 200 feet is a very tall building still, and having a half a block depth or so to kind of buffer it from the corridor would be very appropriate. This is the Biscayne Boulevard site that we looked at. You can see the site that in yellow, it says focus area. And I want to be clear that this doesn't mean we're proposing or recommending 150 feet on this parcel, but this parcel was selected just as a demonstration, and there were two reasons for that. One is the parcel that is to the north of it, which it was originally going to be selected, had experienced recent redevelopment. But the other reason was we were illustrating a concept here, an academic village concept, which you may or may not be interested in. If you go to the next slide, you'll see this is looking south on Dixie Highway and Biscayne Boulevard, Dixie on the brain. And you can see that in the blue, this is 110 feet, and the yellow depicts the 40-foot bonus, so you can see the relationship there. And you can see how these buildings at 150 feet relate in scale to everything around it. This is an oblique view looking north with Biscayne on the right. And this is a street view, a simulated street view, looking west down 123rd. This is the academic village concept that we just sort of ran with. Again, maybe something you're interested in, maybe not. But it was building, we saw an opportunity here with Johnson and Wales University being on the top and north-south corridor running down 123rd, some fairly substantial redevelopment on the site that we picked to model, create sort of an anchor. And in between, you can have various mixed use, you can have mixed use residential, classroom-oriented buildings and university compatible or related development. How such a thing might work is creating the actual destination or anchor to the south as a phase one, then going just immediately south of the university to create a linkage from the university to this area, and then sort of filling in the middle as time goes on. This is a 10 a.m. winter shadow looking at the Biscayne site. This is the shadow here on the cursor. And it encompasses another commercial block, but it's otherwise fairly well contained. The 4 p.m. winter shadow does the same thing, just to the east. I'm just going to summarize the recommendations. For West Dixie, the council was proposing 300 feet, mixed use, and 180 dwelling units per acre. The mixed use is certainly appropriate, but we do recommend mid-rise buildings up to 110 feet that include parking levels. And if you go back to slide 54, that's where we made the recommendation for West Dixie Highway. We believe that mid-rise buildings that include parking and not exceed 110 feet, provided the buildings are transitioned appropriately to adjacent streets and single-family neighborhoods, are very much compatible, and would give North Miami and give West Dixie Highway a very positive, pedestrian-oriented urban streetscape that's also transit supportive. Regulating the density, and this is going to be a theme throughout all of these, regulating the density of each building isn't necessary because you already have accounted for the impacts on water, sewer, parks, schools, because you have this pool of 5,000 units, and this 5,000 units was already approved by the state. You have it on your map, and you have it because you had the facilities to serve it. So at this point in time, you're making, in allocating that density, you could certainly retain a density standard just to control how it's distributed, but you could also do the same type of thing with minimum unit floor areas, which you probably already have, combined with a height limit. And the height limit is addressing the form of the building as opposed to just a density number. An appropriate density for a mid-rise building up to 110 feet would be 75 to 100 units to the acre. 75 is going to be more typically achievable. In an unusual case, you can get more than that. If it was an all-loft project, for example, you might get 100. But typically, they're going to be 70, 75 or less. And again, I want to emphasize that the considerations here was the fact that Dixie Highway is a narrow corridor. It's only 70 feet. It's only 4 lanes, and it traverses predominantly single-family neighborhoods. Due to irregular block and parcel depth, high-rise redevelopment would require entire blocks in order to appropriately transition to a single-family neighborhood. And this would lead to encroachment into those neighborhoods of higher intensity type buildings. On 119th, the City Council proposed 300 feet commercial and office. On slide 58, we make our recommendation. And again, we recommend mid-rise up to 110 feet, including parking levels, subject to appropriate transitioning to the streets and single-family neighborhoods to the rear. Same comment as to density. And this is based on the consistent block depth, which is 250 feet along the north side of 119th, and the fact that it's a 100-foot arterial. Next. On Northwest 7th Avenue, the council recommended 300 feet on the east side, commercial and office, and retaining the 55 on the west. This was slide 60 that we discussed this. We concur with the 55 feet on the west and would recommend up to 200 feet on the east side, including parking levels, but again, requiring a height transition down to Northwest 7th, so the buildings that high are not fronting the actual Northwest 7th corridor. Densities of up to 50 units to the acre on the west side, and for residential uses, 175 on the east would pretty much accommodate anything. Biscayne Boulevard, this was the site that was modeled for 110 feet plus 40 feet of bonus height. And again, the recommendation is 110 with 40 feet in bonus being an appropriate height for the study site. Densities of 100 to 125 units to the acre are appropriate for a 150-foot building to accommodate just about any residential proposal. And this is based on the land uses and the development patterns surrounding the Biscayne site. Biscayne is a large principal arterial, and you've got very large parcels surrounding it, and they're largely non-residential. So the compatibility and the scale issue is not as much of a concern. Also, we cited the potential academic village concept. So in summary, it's not necessary to regulate density site by site, given the pool of bonus units, minimum floor area requirements for dwelling units, which you probably have, are preferable to density limitations. And we gave you a range of densities for the various building heights that would accommodate just about any project that was proposed. Separately, we looked at the North Bayshore Drive property, and we modeled this one. We modeled a 250-foot building first, and in the blue is what the 250-foot would look like. From the bay side, you can see that on the next slide. It's quite a bit taller than the condo that exists further south on the bend. And this is looking at it from Bayshore Drive. This building had to have approximately a 60-foot setback from the shoreline because of county shoreline development standards. And in this case, you have a parking garage that's several stories that would come very close to the street in order to make a 250-foot tower happen. The considerations in evaluating this 250-foot height are the local residential street frontage. This parcel's at the edge of a single-family neighborhood. It's a very shallow parcel. It's less than 200 feet in depth. The county building restrictions, including the setback and a 100-foot view corridor that's required. The length of the shadow cast over the adjacent single-family residential neighborhood, and the minimum necessary scale of parking structures at the street's edge relative to the single-family residential across the street, and the maximum possible setback we could achieve with that. I don't know what it is with 110, 115 feet, but it's what we came up with here. And I want to be clear that we're not recommending 115. We're just saying that at 115 feet, the impacts of this building to the neighborhood can be minimized. And it can be minimized because we don't need a multi-level parking structure. It can be more of a parking below and above a deck type situation. The building is pushed, the building itself, the tower, is pushed all the way back and graduated in a step-like fashion to reduce the shadows. So this is the visualization from the bay to the 115-foot tower. An appropriate density would be 100 units to the acre. Typical densities would be 75. And reducing the height limits from 250 to 115 eliminates the need for the multi-level garage at the street front that would be quite incompatible with the single-family residences. And this is a visualization of the 115 feet where you can see the parking underneath the building, similar to the tower, that's the taller tower that's at the bend. And finally, we know there were some questions as far as recommendations for the transit station overlay. We didn't make any, and I know the council proposed a 300-foot maximum height, but there's a policy that's in the proposed plan update that you're considering tonight, and that recommendation in the policy, and it's policy 1.3.7 in the future land use element, is not to establish intensity parameters at this time. The reason is because this is a fairly large area. The overlay concept on the map is not a hard and fast district. It's not like the NRO where you can do certain things inside but you can't do them outside or at the same intensity. It's a conceptual place marker, if you will. It's a planning primer for something that's going to happen in the future and a planning area that should be studied further. And so the policy goes into detail about the consensus-driven type process and a study similar to what we did here today, but perhaps even more detailed and looking at the various uses and parcels and blocks in the area and where the train station site might ultimately be located. So we did not make any recommendations for that area. Eric did find out that the coastal link, the Aventura connection, can happen as soon as another 3 to 4 years. and North Miami is one of those stops en route from downtown to Aventura, so that's definitely something you'll want to get ahead of. And that concludes the presentation of the study. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a question, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
That was a magnificent presentation, absolutely outstanding.
Thank you.
Why didn't we see that? Why didn't we see that 2 weeks ago? And this may be more of a question for staff. Why didn't we see that the night we went till 4 a.m. instead of now? Because I think that changes so much. What changed?
Through the mayor, Councilman Galvin, the difference in the presentation tonight was once we did go over everything with the council and directives were given and we knew what the feasibility was going to be, we then were able to give clear direction and let the consultants know exactly what we wanted and what the council wanted to see. So we just gave them a little clearer direction on what we wanted to see to move forward, what we thought the major points were, and then we just had them address those specifically.
Well, just a note for 7 years from now. Do something like this first, model some possibilities before you just let up. Because it's true, we were making it up here, and it's not that we weren't well-intentioned, but we didn't have any parameters or guidelines to go by. So I thought this was an outstanding presentation, and I tip my proverbial hat to you guys for putting something together.
Thank you, and we're glad it helps.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead.
In your studies, did you go out to the properties and see what you were looking at and experience?
Yes,
So you sat there?
we took it in.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I still have a problem with density. I will still put my objection. I don't think it's going to matter, but I still feel that on Biscayne Boulevard, north of 123rd for a few blocks, there's no secondary access. The road has been closed. So you've got this big arrow on one of your slides, but you realize that is not for driving. That's only pedestrian. So there is no secondary road. So you're looking for higher densities, 75 to 125, and the height is right across the street from a residential neighborhood, even though there's a transition, and with no egress to the north out of several of these parcels. It concerns me putting this kind of density when the traffic now goes from 123rd and stacks up the other day back to 130th at McDonald's. So you're looking for 125 density there. That bothers me, and it bothers the residents. Did you experience the traffic? Did you sit there and watch it backing up, and you can still propose 125 density?
The scope of this study was design, with compatibility. We were not, anytime that you have higher density concentrated with high rises, you're going to have a concentrated traffic impact. And those are all factors to be considered, but that was not within the scope of what we were looking
So
at.
you didn't consider traffic, you didn't consider the fact that on the west side of these properties are going to be built, there is no north-south access out of the properties, and even exiting, there is actually no north egress of these properties onto Biscayne Boulevard. So that's not even looked into. And that concerns me, and I'm, this anti-development, but it concerns me that you can't get out of these properties and you're just put more density there. So you have not even looked at that issue. You're just,
It's
you're
not
drawing
part of
pictures
what we
on
were looking
papers. Okay, so people understand we're looking at pictures on papers, we're not really feeling the neighborhood and what the traffic is already. Thank you.
And just for, Mr. Mayor, through you to the presenter, just for clarification, your Biscayne Boulevard recommendations are for the west side of Biscayne Boulevard, not the east side of Biscayne Boulevard.
Correct.
Okay, you specified between west and east of Northwest 7th Avenue, but I didn't quite hear it for the Biscayne Boulevard. Just wanted people, if this does get approved in some form like what we did, don't think that we're just approving this for the east side of Biscayne. Your recommendation for the 110 plus the 40 additional is for the west side of Biscayne Boulevard.
And even with that parcel, we weren't looking at the maximum possible. We were looking at the specific recommendation of 110 plus 40 and found that from a design standpoint, a compatibility standpoint, it works.
What is the 40 please.
Those are it's a bonus height for accomplishing various things, such as providing open space, affordable housing, things like this. You get
Lead.
additional height.
Would lead.
All right. So I think I'm just going to echo what the Councilman Galvin said. It's easier to go through mud going forward than backing up in mud. Okay, so these type of presentations should have been done during the workshops, not even a couple of weeks ago. These should have been workshops. So I don't know what we're missing here in North Miami, but something is missing. Something is missing. So we have to depart from the status quo, guys. Come on. You guys messed up my night a couple of weeks ago, stayed here till 4 o'clock in the morning. Had we had this presentation a couple of weeks ago, we would have been out of here by 9 o'clock. This is a wonderful, I don't want to say impeccable, because only God is. But on a scale of 1 to 10, I probably would give you guys an 11. And again, going forward, guys, let's try to do this the right way so that you don't waste the residents' time and also your fellow, council people, because we do have a life too. Whatever we can do to make it easier, I think we should aim at doing that. Again, congratulations for a wonderful presentation. So I believe the public needs to be heard. Public hearing is open. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, public hearing. We're going to try our best to limit it to 1 minute and 59 seconds. Please.
I tend to be a bit of a troublemaker. My name is Robert Hughes at 1150 Northeast 123rd Street. I actually spent the time today reading through that comprehensive development plan, and for the most part, I was pretty pleased with it. I like the idea of 110-foot buildings. I like the idea of 110-foot buildings over 300. It's less, it has more of a friendly, urban, chic, hip feel. And it reminds me of what the development they're doing along Biscayne Boulevard corridor from 55th Street up to 79th Street as part of an economic redevelopment, and it is attractive. My only concerns, like Councilwoman Keith says, if they are going to develop the Johnson and Wales site, then they're going to have to open up that pedestrian walkway to allow for traffic. They're going to have to widen Northeast 16th Avenue to allow for access through the bypass on Emerald Lake to 135th Street. And that, as a backway, would alleviate some of the traffic problems that Councilwoman Keys addresses. And lastly, but not leastly, looking at the land use map, I just want to make sure that the NRO line stays at 124th Street between Northeast 8th Avenue and Northeast 10th Avenue. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Public hearing is still open, and public hearing.
Good evening, Josh Dubin. I'm the property owner at 1896 Northeast 123rd Street. I'm just really here for a clarification, and I'm not sure I'll get a chance later to ask. If this goes to vote tonight and you pass it, is it what was presented last time plus all the comments that were made and all the revisions that were agreed to? And specifically, I'm asking because my property, as you recall, is zoned RM5, future land use commercial. On the future land use map, you changed it to residential with 110 feet, and then you lowered it back to 55, and we spoke about it, and I think the commission was in agreement that we were just going to leave it the way it was before it was changed to residential. And I think there was concurrence on that, and I want to be sure that that's what's happening here so that it doesn't get passed in a different format after we've discussed it. And if that is the case, I want to thank you for being willing to take a look at that as you did last time. Thank you.
You want to wait until after the meeting, after public hearing? Or?
Do you want me to clarify
Tanya?
now, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
Okay, we just wanted to concur with the comment that was made
Correct.
at the last meeting on the 25th. We know that several residents made recommendations for certain map amendments. In this property owner's case, he wants to make sure the designation stays the same as it was in 2007. At the time, the board said, sure, it will stay the same as it was in 2007. So he just wants to echo that those sentiments that were shared back on the 25th are still standing and still relevant. And they are, is the nod that I'm getting from council. It's really an answer for council more so than staff. Council heard the recommendations, and those have already been written into the public record, and tonight they're nodding again saying, we've heard you. It's kind of the way the process works.
I just wanted to be clear that you're not going to transmit with the change to higher density residential. When it gets transmitted, it will show that it is what it was.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
William Prevotel, 11950 North Bay Shore Drive. Councilman Galvin, I agree. That was a great presentation. It was a great presentation that should have been with us 6 months ago, if not earlier, because we've asked for that for a year and a half now. I can appreciate that presentation as well, having my master's in urban design. It was really nice. It has the ability to do what we do at school, which is detach from reality. And that's the problem with this. We have asked time and time again for economic feasibility, and it has failed. There is nothing, there is zero in that entire presentation that allows anything to be built. Before you have a matrix of costs, of what the square foot cost they'd have to sell it at. You've had this for a number of weeks, you have it again, they've had it, they never responded to it. The bottom line is you have to have a building about 25 to 30 stories high in order to bring that cost down to $500 a square foot. What's the highest ever sold here in North Miami? A little bit over $300 a square foot. But if you do anything less than that, it's going to cost more. It's going to cost $700, possibly $1,000 a square foot. It's never been responded to. It's totally irrational. We have to have something. Our city manager confirmed that Biscayne Landing said, and where was that? Where was Biscayne Landing mentioned? Because they've done 300 feet. I didn't see any study for the 450 feet that's being proposed. They get away with everything. They can monopolize the entire city? I don't understand. That's not part of what's in question? Anyway, going back to the costs, $500 a square feet. It's been confirmed at Biscayne Landing that their towers have to sell at $500 a square foot in order to break even. They're 25, now 400 stories, 400 feet high, and they got this incredible economy of scale. If they can't do it, and they're crying poverty, the billionaire developers that they are, how is anybody else in the city supposed to do this? You have right down the road, and if maybe they didn't see it after studying these areas, you have a one-story building that was 1 block just east of City Hall. Anybody know why it's 1 story? If this is so desirable, it's 1 story because it's a taxpayer. It's there just to pay for the taxes, and they couldn't even pay for another slab, another set of walls, because it made no economic sense to do that.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you very much. And please consider my report. It has the Breezy Enclave, it has the bonus incentive, and it has what could be a 300-foot building. Thank you.
All right. Public hearing is now closed. Nobody came forward. We have 2 mics.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead. Go right ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council. I was here several months ago when you had one of the early workshops, and I agree with you. The presentation tonight was incredibly informative and illustrative. I'm an architect and
Just your name and address for the record, please.
Thank you. Marcus Frankel, architect, at 1177 Kane Concourse, Bay Harbor Island. I'm a close neighbor by. And I represent a developer called Blue Road Development, also from Bay Harbor Island, who's doing several projects in Miami and North Miami Beach. This would be the first one in North Miami. We're very encouraged to hear about your revitalization, your planning department's objectives, and the opportunities to revitalize certain neighborhoods. Our site is in your downtown district. It's actually on 124th Street, 950 Northeast 124th. I mentioned this to you several months ago. And it's bordered on the east by 10th Avenue, northeast, across from Villa Maria Nursing Home and Rehab Center. And it's essentially a half a block, and it's about 2 acres. It goes to 123rd Street. The intention for that site, as we discussed with your planners, who encouraged us to continue with the idea, is a new mixed-use residential development essentially residential for workforce housing, for elderly housing, and for student housing, and mixing into it on the ground level all the way around the 3 right-of-ways that I mentioned, retail and an urban plaza that wraps around 10th Avenue, 124th, and 123rd with about 20 to 25 feet of landscape depth and hardscape. There would also be parking, of course. It would really bring vitality to your downtown district. Housing, as the planners described, it's something like a T4 or T5 development that would bring vitality.
All right,
of
Mr.
daytime
Franco,
and
we have a
nighttime
limit of 2 minutes. Tonight
Okay.
is very tight, and we're
All right.
trying to move it on.
All right, just to sum it
So-
up, we would also consider medical facilities that correlate with the Villa Maria, recreational, possibly educational, and we think it would be something that would fall. We don't need you to overlay to move the urban boundary, but it works a lot better. Not the urban boundary.
You have to wrap it up, Mr.
Yeah.
Franco,
If your
please.
NRO could move 1 block to the south, it would greatly encourage this type of mixed-use development. We
Thank
spoke
you.
to the neighbors.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
We
thank
have
you.
to stop it. Thank you, please.
Mr. Mayor, just for a point of clarity,
Yeah.
are we gonna discuss the supermajority, or are we just discussing height right now? Are we gonna come back to this and discuss?
The whole thing,
You're discussing the whole thing?
yes.
Name and address, sir.
Or you're gonna have a chance at it?
No, this is it.
Okay, first of all, I agree with most of the plan I saw here tonight. There is nothing wrong with density, there's nothing wrong with height. I left before you a thing from the Urban Land Institute. Get the report, read it. We don't have to be afraid of it. I just did a trip all over the United States, New York, Washington, Seattle, what have you. There is nothing wrong with density and height. I hear traffic. Folks, we live in a major metropolitan area. What are we gonna do, go back to the horse and buggy, for God's sakes? We live in a major metropolitan area. Traffic is a reality of life, okay? Secondly, let's talk about I had a big list here of things. The supermajority. Absolutely, I'm against it. And in fact, your planning commission voted 6-1 to get rid of it. 6-1. And we would have been 7-0, but Councilwoman Keys put a new member on there from Keystone Point. Let me rush through this real fast.
Yeah,
There are
45
2
seconds.
districts that come out of Keystone Point, District 1 and District 2. It's almost like being gerrymandered. For some reason, the homeowners over there, and I don't disparage them in any form, fashion, or matter, God bless them, I like walking through there, that's a beautiful neighborhood. But they collectively do not want height and development, okay? They don't want to go over 110 feet. They don't own Biscayne Boulevard or what's west of Biscayne Boulevard, okay? The rest of us people, we count too. I want a good quality of life. I want to live in a nice neighborhood. And when I look at Venice Park Drive and Venice Lane, all that stuff should be knocked down there, and it should go 300 feet. Let me give you the definition of a map. A map is a geographical representation of the Earth's surface drawn to scale on a plane. Excuse me.
I'm sorry,
Okay?
Chief,
Drawn to
if
scale on
I
a
do it
plane.
for one, I have to do it for all. I'm very sorry. You have to
Okay.
wrap it up. 5 seconds.
Okay, drawn to scale on, it doesn't give you the flesh and the blood and the heartbeat of the neighborhood, and that's what counts. I live here, I work here, I worked here, I walk through the streets of this city, I know what should come down, I know the heartbeat of this city. I'm not blind to it, I know the alleys and the streets.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, one question. We just went through a budget hearing tonight, and we're scraping pennies, and you know, wanna know why? Because we don't have development in this city, and we need it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank- Go ahead, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Shirley Stock, 923 Northeast 123rd Street. I'm part owner of that property. I'm also a commercial realtor, and I've got a better? Okay. I'm an owner of 923 Northeast 123rd Street. I'm also a commercial realtor, and I have a very long history with this city, doing other things aside from just real estate. I had a very unfortunate incident. I brought a client to the 123rd, 125th Street corridor recently, an investor who's bought quite a bit of property. And what he was considering doing was putting up an open MRI center. I drag investors to North Miami because I really love this community, and I think it has the potential to be the next spot. And we drove around, and I brought this gentleman here a number of times. He's already bought a small, a 6-unit apartment building, and I've been educating him as to the potential and really the beauty of this community. He just backed out on a piece of property, and he said to me, "Shirley, I have 2 problems." And I said, "What are they?" He said, "I go online, I read the urban plan, I can't figure out what the hell I'm supposed to be able to do with this property because nobody can figure out how anything is zoned, how tall anything is going to be. I'm going to invest a couple of $1 million, and I don't know what I'm going to do with the property." The other thing he said to me later was, this is probably the 8th time I brought him into North Miami, and I wouldn't have put, I'm not a wealthy person, I wouldn't have put my own money in North Miami if I didn't believe that it had a future. And he said to me, the saddest thing I saw in the last year in North Miami, I'll finish one sentence. He said, I see two more dollar stores and a nail salon moving in and the Starbucks moving out. Why should I come into a community and bring my tax dollars where all you can do is a dollar store and the Starbucks is running away?
All right, thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. It's an honor to be here. My name is Kevin Seifried. I live at 12665 Northwest 8th Avenue on the west side of the city. As you know, I chair the Planning Commission and have done so for a good many years. The presentation tonight was nice. It was colorful. It would have been better if we'd had that a year ago as a beginning point. Unfortunately, we did not. Not because the Planning Commission didn't ask for it. Staff just couldn't figure out how to get that done. Now, we're here today discussing whether or not we should colorize Leave It to Beaver episodes instead of visioning for a new city. What's missing from this plan, and they've admitted it, is no economic proof that their plan is viable, because they weren't asked to do that. The one thing we need, they weren't asked to do, and that was economic feasibility for their height and density issues. Without that, we are still working in the dark. Having said that, we need development, and the height and density are not all that relevant. We need projects that are economically viable, and this plan tonight isn't showing that. Thank you very much. Have a great evening and good luck.
Good evening. My name is Fred Stock, and I'm at 735 Northeast 125th Street. I'm the CEO of Jewish Community Services of South Florida, right across the street from City Hall. I also sit on the DAPAC Planning Committee for the downtown redevelopment area. About 3 weeks ago, my wife and I went up to a community in Broward called Delray Beach. I think you've all been there, okay? And I have to tell you, it took me about 45 minutes to drive about 3/4 of a mile on the main street that Delray Beach's downtown has achieved some amazing redevelopment. I would love to see that in North Miami. And for all of you who talk about traffic, in any major city, you're going to have traffic in its downtown area. To me, that's a good thing. The bottom line is, do you want to create a community that is a destination, not a pass-through? We're already a pass-through. That's the idea. You want to get past 123rd Street to I-95 as quickly as possible. That's a wrong way of looking at it. You really could create a downtown that's economically feasible if you can attract the development. It has to be right-sized. I agree. And I agree that the presentation tonight did a great attempt to right-size that development. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, John Stembridge, I'm the chairman of the DAPAC committee, and Fred is the vice chairman. I'd like to reiterate what he just said, what former Police Chief Kenny Eats said. I don't think North Miami should be afraid of density or height. When I was mayor, it was only 4 floors, and it has continued that way until 2007. When Mike McDermott, chairman of the Charter Review Board, asked my help, and also Kevin Burns became the mayor, and we were able to increase the density. Now then, I said here when we lost Mocha, yes, it's a gym, but we don't have the tax revenues that major cities have to provide the benefits for its citizens that we desperately need. And I would like to urge this city to take a giant step forward tonight and allow prosperity to come into this city once and for all. It hurts me when I see what the quality city that Aventura has built, Sunny Isles, Bal Harbor, Surfside, Midtown, downtown Miami, Brickell, Coral Gables, and we've been bypassed, and it's within our prerogative to do so. I spoke at a campaign meeting at Sunny Isles, and this young lady was running, she was elected, but they were talking about density, and I happened to speak. And I said, you know what? There's a reason every one of you are living here in Sunny Isles. You know why? Because you want to be by the ocean. But the problem is you're not the only one that wants to be by the ocean. Everybody else. Now, if you have a problem with density and height, then maybe you should consider moving to a less density area. But we are in a major metropolitan area. We are not going to become less dense, but it requires us to use intelligence and wise planning to bring quality development into this city, Mr. Mayor, and members of this council. And I, for one, will be rooting for you to do the right thing. Thank you very much.